Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, looking forward to talking to you about your cooking and upcoming cookbook, which is exciting. Are you ready for your cookbook to be coming out soon?
Yeah, it's funny because I've been staring at it for the last 3 years, working on it for God knows how many years. So I know I'm proud of it. It's beautiful, but now I'm just nervous about how the world's gonna perceive it. So it's a little nerve-wracking, yeah.
How long's that process been? When did you start?
I started working on the manuscript for the cookbook probably about 7, 8 years ago, and then the manuscript actually became like the seed for Augie's Counter, which is my restaurant.
7 or 8 years ago. That's a lot. That's a long time.
Yeah, I had this idea and I figured it was, I knew it was something that was special and worth exploring. And my problem is that I didn't have a platform. I didn't have enough followers on Instagram, as publishers will tell you.
I just talked
So
about this with someone, a branding and marketing specialist last week on our episode, which is a sad thing, that
yeah.
you have to have this, you have to come with this built-in huge following and say, these people already love me. Like, please,
Mhm.
help me get
Yeah,
this
and
book out in the world.
doesn't necessarily always matter, the content of the book or the subject matter. It's just, sometimes it just depends on the number of followers you have. So, but c'est la vie. That's this day and age.
Yeah. Well, a little background for you and my listeners. I have some experience in this type of cooking. So I grew up New England, eating very traditional, like American foods and so forth. I don't feel like I had an upbringing where my relatives had any interesting heritage. We all came over from England on the Mayflower and,
Yeah.
pretty bland type cooking. But interestingly enough, I somehow found myself running two separate Jewish retirement communities in pretty hardcore kosher kitchens, which
Right on.
I had no experience with that. And the interesting thing, and I'm sure from having grandmothers who cook many of these types of food, is they're all like trying to give me their recipes, but then also judging what I'm making. So here I am, like New England boy now cooking this woman's maybe Hungarian recipe that she hands me because that's what they want to have, and now I'm cooking it for like 600 people, and
Oh,
I've never
wow.
even eaten this before. So
Yeah. And they're also telling you that you're not fat enough. That's, but
Nobody
then,
has ever told me I'm not fat enough. I'm like 270, so that's not a thing with me. Maybe with
no,
you.
I
Yeah.
feel like, no, like my grandmother, I mean, went through those like awkward teen years and, it just, my weight like would fluctuate. And especially because I was cooking in kitchens and, it was always like, I was either not fat enough and not fed well enough, or I was not skinny enough. And therein lies the Jewish grandmother complex.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't have my own Jewish grandmother, but I feel like I've had hundreds of them, if that makes any
Yeah,
sense,
no,
especially
totally.
to anyone who's done that kind of thing, working like a retirement community.
Well, it's a
So
noble deed, so good for you.
yes. Um, so you have a restaurant in Brooklyn and you have a cookbook coming out. How do you describe your food and cuisine? Like, because it seems to be rooted in Jewish and Eastern European and Hungarian, but I know you also do a lot of kind of modern twists on things. So what are your restaurant and cookbook like?
Yeah, the restaurant and the cookbook are one and the same, but also two very different things at the same time. The restaurant, so Augie's Counter, was born in November of 2021, and I always knew I would have a restaurant. That was like my end goal. And when I'd been working on the cookbook, but when I started shopping the manuscript around, I said, well, if this is not going to work now, I should do what I know how to do. And that's working, open up a restaurant. I mean, not that I've had experience opening restaurants, but obviously not the one footing all the money. So I took that concept of the book, more or less, of exploring Eastern European and Hungarian and this modern Jewish New York diner cuisine, and putting it into a restaurant. And I was really inspired by the grand cafes of Eastern Europe. I had spent a lot of time out in Hungary, and Austria, and I wanted to take the concept of an Eastern European like Grand Cafe, downsize it, and cram it into a Crown Heights restaurant in Brooklyn. So that's how Augie's Counter came to be.
When was the first time you went to Hungary? Like, did you go when you were younger, or is it more of a
Yeah.
recent thing?
Yeah, I went to Hungary when I think the first time I went, I was like 7 or 8 years
Oh,
old.
okay, pretty young.
Yeah, and I have family out there. My grandmother, so my grandmother Aggie, her nephew Peter lives out there with his partner Robert, and then his nephew, um, who's much younger, Ferry and his family. So I go and I visit them from time to time.
So you had one grandmother who was Hungarian. The other one, what was her background?
Yeah, so Nana Arlene she grew up in the Bronx, born and raised, and is originally, well, her family is Sephardic, so it's like Jewish Greek. And same thing as Hungarians, lots of food, lots of alcohol. Family is always, at the center of attention. And yeah, so I kind of had very two similar worlds on either end of the grandma spectrum.
So did you grow up in that stereotypical, like you hear all the chef stories, like I grew up with the love of cooking because of my grandmother, which I didn't actually have, but
Yeah.
was that your experience? Like that your grandmothers had this strong influence on you in cooking?
Yes and no. So Grandma Aggie was actually, I mean, she really pushed me out of the kitchen. She didn't think that a man should cook. So that was just like very difficult for her to wrap her head around anytime I had questions about food. Um, and while I enjoyed her cooking, I think it didn't really occur to me that what she was making was really unique and special. I thought like maybe everyone had a Hungarian grandmother. I don't know. It was just I was young and naive. And my other grandmother, Arlene, was definitely the one that like made really extravagant meals. Was the Martha Stewart of the family, and she got me my first kitchen job. So I would say that she very much so pushed me into. Well, I guess she like nurtured my love for food and cooking.
Oh, that's very cool. And I saw you still have a blog from like when you were really young. That's if
Yeah,
you dig in the right places on the internet and you still have that up. I like to do a little investigative
yeah.
journalism before I have these interviews, but you still have this like blog from like over a decade ago.
Yeah, it's not active anymore, but it is. I thought it's hard to get things off the internet, as I learned. But I also at one point I just stopped trying, and I was like, maybe it'll just move to the dark web, and no one will know it exists anymore. Uh, but yeah, it was an inch growing up in kitchens and in a very specific time of kitchens, like 2000, in the early 2000s, um, was a weird and bizarre time because people were also, the internet was still like in ways fresh, and maybe it still is, but eh, having a blog was not something that a young line cook, I think, had back in the 70s, obviously, or the 80s or the 90s. And so, yeah, I think the blog was because everybody else was doing it.
Yeah.
And you probably saw, I saw like Julia and Julia, the movie, and I read the book, and I was like, yeah, I could have a blog. And I didn't have a lot of friends who cooked, and none of my friends cooked, and I wanted to be able to connect with people my age, hopefully, that did share my interest in it. And I did. I wound up making like pen pals, and I had like some followers, and it got me into some really cool kitchens, and I got to interview some chefs. So I don't regret it, but because I have nothing to compare it to, if that makes any sense. Like there were chefs, right, like Anthony Bourdain or Jody Williams or Andrew Carmelini, like they grew up with like a rigorous. I went to France and trained in a Michelin
Yeah.
star restaurant, and I'm like, but I had a blog.
Yeah.
So it's a weird time. It was a weird time.
No, my personal chef business, it's called Perfect Little Bites, and before it was a business, it was actually a blog.
Mhm.
And if you dig deep enough, I was just thinking about this yesterday. my first recipe, I made a Doritos panna cotta,
Nice.
and I took fresh salsa and like you know how when you make your fresh, like the whole bottom is just like watery with tomato juice. I turned that into a caramel sauce. So it was like a Doritos panna cotta with like this tomato water caramel sauce. I'm
Amazing.
should I like? I feel like this should come down. You know, it was like from like 14 years ago, and
No,
it's
the
still
world
like,
should know about it.
well, I'm thinking it's going to be a fun like throwback Thursday post one day. Like, look
Yeah.
how far I've come from this nonsense that I used to do. But yeah, I digress. And then you went to CIA, which you actually did not finish out at CIA, right? You
Yeah.
went. So what I want to ask you about that is, how do you know that it's not right for you? Because a lot of people would, sunk costs. I've already got, a year in or whatever and some money. I guess I'm just going to see this thing through. A lot of parents, I think, would say, like, just finish out and get your degree. So
Mhm.
how did you know that culinary school wasn't right for you?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a working background. I worked in kitchens through high school, and I also my father and my grandfather owned a pharmacy and surgical supply business. So in the summers, that's how I earned my money, and I worked behind the cash register. And I just I was a busybody, and I just loved learning on the job. And it for all the chefs that I had worked for in Florida, all had gone to culinary school, and most of them had gone to the CIA. So it was just I was kind of brainwashed into thinking like this was the end all be all, and I had to go to school, or else I wouldn't be a successful chef. And I really didn't think twice about that. So I went, and I got through almost my first year, right up until my externship. You go, they send you out into the real world, and I, while a lot of peers went to go on and work in hotels or resorts or cruises, I really wanted to work at a restaurant called Prune, a very small restaurant in the East Village at the time. And um, so I left to go there, and I fell in love with it. And I didn't like my dream was to always work in New York City, and I was there, and I was, you know, not really making any money, and lived in literally a shoebox. My bed took up the entire room, but I loved every second of it. You know, it was like a 19-year-old. You were just, I don't know, everything. It was just so fresh and new. So I had done some listening to a radio show that had Andrew Carmelini on it, and he was talking about whether to go to culinary school or not, and he wound up through this radio show solidifying my decision to not go back.
The power of radio, folks. Here we are on a
Yeah.
podcast. Maybe this will inspire someone to drop out of culinary school,
Yeah.
right? Just as the school year is getting ready to start. No, it's hard. I mean, I went to Johnson and Wales. I went for 4 years. It
Hmm.
was really expensive. I've talked a lot about that, and you know, I graduated in '98, so it was a number of years ago, and things were very different. And people say, "Would you do it over again?" And it's hard to look at that, but in today's day and age, I don't think I'd recommend it. Now, it might be the right fit for some people, but
Sure.
if I was graduating from like high school today, I think there's a lot better options for me that I would instead of pursuing culinary school.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, yeah, it's definitely not, it's, it's made for some people, it's not made for some people. And it just really, like, if you were going to go be a manager or a chef, like in a hotel or maybe like in a resort, I don't know, like there's different, I think different people respond to school differently. So I feel just for me, it just wasn't in the cards. But yeah, I also had to literally pay the price, and that was paying off my student loans for another, 12 years. So,
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. I've been there. Many of my listeners have been there. But New York City, I've never worked in New York, but I can't imagine a better place. Like if you're looking to really learn to be a cook and a chef, I mean, if you're in New York City, I
yeah,
think you're gonna learn what you need to do.
yeah, it was just, it really was, I felt like I owned the city, and maybe a lot of young cooks kind of feel that way, but just everything is, yeah, it's so fresh, and you're big-eyed, and there's all the old cookbook stores here, and there's JB Prince, that kitchen store that's like all the way on top of a skyscraper, and like you have to take this secret elevator to get there, and
The mecca of food supply stores, right?
yeah, and you're running around to different spice shops because, the chef told you, hands you some pocket money, and you're running through the streets. I don't know. That was my experience. So, I loved every second of it. Yeah.
So, how does that move into you opening your own place, which is a huge undertaking? And you said 2021, so um, I'm not going to say post pandemic because we were still very much in it, So, the
Yeah.
process of getting a restaurant open in a very weird time in probably one of the most expensive cities in the country and all of that. How did opening a restaurant come about?
Yeah. It's all blur. So, parts of it are blur for sure, but it's a long story. But the synopsis is that I had moved out to Los Angeles actually prior to 2021, and to be with my boyfriend. We were doing long distance at the time, and I spent about 3 years out in LA, and I just kept telling him, I need to go back. I need to go back. That's where I love New York. That's where my heart is, and when I go back, I need to open up a restaurant. And the pandemic had just started, and I think everybody was, like everybody was doing, you're, kind of just sitting on your hands and thinking about life.
Lots of
And
free
it's
time.
lots of free time. So I said, well, I might as well just start piecing this business plan together a little bit more seriously. And so that came to fruition. And then also the financial part of it, I had no clue. I mean, I had some savings, but I really, a restaurant could take hundreds of thousands of dollars to open, even millions. And so I decided to just turn to the people, and I launched a Kickstarter, which is a little unheard of for a restaurant.
Yeah,
Because
it's
usually,
rare. I've supported a couple of those, but you don't see a lot of them.
yeah, it's Kickstarter or these sort of crowdfunding websites are made for, things that are more tangible, like that'll get shipped over the country, like a game or an
Send me a
electronic.
cookbook. Like I've backed some cookbooks on
Yeah.
Kickstarter. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, I didn't know how it would turn out. We asked for $65,000, and we raised it, which was amazing and a total surprise. And as soon as that happened, we came back to New York and started looking for spaces. And I wound up falling in love with a space that I had my very first pop up in, like years before that. So it was just kind of kismet that would be the space. And Augie's Counter was born. Yeah.
Wow. And it seems like such a very personal restaurant based on, it's your heritage and, cuisines that you love. When did you start cooking? Have you cooked that food professionally before that? Like, had you done Hungarian, Eastern European, like in any kind of restaurant setting?
Yeah. So before I moved out to LA, I was the chef of a restaurant called The Eddy, and I also took over its sister restaurant, The Wallflower. I started there as a line cook and worked my way up to sous, and eventually came back and took over. And I had been doing these like pop-ups that were reimagining Eastern European food. It was like heavily market driven, and the owner of the Eddy and Wallflower had approached me. He's like, you should really take this and do it at the Eddy. So that's what I did. And it's funny because there's like the beginnings of Augie's Counter, and like the food and the style were like there, but obviously was received very differently because I think of just like the time where it was located. It was in East Village, and maybe people didn't really know what to make of it. I think post-pandemic, people are really open to a lot of different foods now. Like there's more, like food is more story-driven. I feel like I don't know, personally, that's what I feel like people are into now. So, it's fantastic. So I feel like my type of cooking is maybe more, like people are more open to it now.
Well, and New York is unlike any other city, probably anywhere in the world, but especially with the variety of food. But for so many years, obviously in this country, it seems like we've been, the cuisine's been French and Italian, and then a lot of Asian, Chinese,
Mhm.
and then like Mexican, but you didn't see as many, at least not in my travels and where I've lived, so many of these kind of European, Hungarian type restaurants. Is that new-ish to the New York City area as well?
It's interesting because it isn't, but it is. I think in the way that I'm presenting it, it is. I mean, Eastern Europeans have been in New York City since the dawn of New York City,
Sure.
and little Hungary and little like Ukraine, and there's the whole Polish area, and it's just there's so it's everywhere here. There's an entire festival dedicated to borscht and latkes. So
It's pretty niche.
yeah, so it's I mean it's a part of the fabric of New York City, but I wasn't seeing chefs approach this food in a different light, which I was questioning why that was.
So I don't like to use the. I mean, maybe you can use the term. Is your so your food is modern? Would you say like modern versions of it, like taking the classics and then maybe really focusing on what's fresh and local in the market, maybe incorporating a different technique or something? And I guess is this food that your Hungarian relatives would recognize as Hungarian food?
Eh, no, the answer is no, and that's okay because I don't claim to be authentic or traditional. People always will always get Hungarians or older. Usually, it's an older generation or older Jews come in that want to experience something, nostalgic, and they want to relive a certain, very specific memory. And while that's beautiful, that's not something I'm here to do. Um, and they want that authentic, that taste, and exactly what their grandmother made, and that's not what I'm doing. It's inspired by, and I stretch it and I pull it, and it takes us in different directions. So, um, yeah, it's sometimes it's a hard line to walk.
What are some of those favorite dishes of yours that are clearly inspired by, but also have an interesting twist?
It's all kind of mashed up, so it's hard to pick one. But I guess like the semolina dumplings on our dinner menu, that was a recipe that my grandmother had made, and they weren't, they were very like rustic shaped dumplings, but they were very airy, and she had them, and she would serve them next to like braised chicken or goulash or some sort of stew. And I wanted to take those dumplings and make them the center focus of a dish. And so I had to rework the recipe to make them even lighter and more perfectly round, because that's how I imagined, that's how I wanted them to be. And we kind of changed the sets up, and there's been a version with like cured egg yolk and crispy chicken skin, and um, we've had a bunch of really different beautiful cheeses with it, and shaved romanesco squash. And so yeah, I took something that was traditional in one sense and nostalgic to me, but I made it the main focus and also changed up the dish entirely. Like it wasn't just a side companion anymore, it was the main star of the dish.
Well, a lot of that home style cooking doesn't really translate well to a more finer dining kind of experience either. Because I've tried to do the same thing. Like some of the dishes I grew up with, and you're like, that's kind of ugly brown food, and it's not a lot of fresh produce.
Hmm.
My mom had recipes where we're using canned mushrooms. It's like, why would anyone use canned mushrooms? Like, even just get button mushrooms at the grocery store. But
Sure.
so many of those recipes. So taking some of those dishes that I loved as a kid and making them a little more chefy, I guess, if you will.
Also, Hungarian food isn't like, it can be like brown food. A lot of it is. But I mean, it's delicious, but it's like this braised, very heavy food. And I actually remember the late Mimi Sheridan had come into the Eddy, and she said, it was in the middle of summer, it was July. She used to be a food critic, and she was like, I don't know how old she was at this point, maybe like in her 80s. And she had asked me she goes, I came here because I heard that you make Hungarian food. And I was actually in the dining room talking to her, and I said, well, no, it's inspired by. And she goes, well, too bad, because I came here in the middle of July to eat a veal goulash, which would be essentially like this like heavy
Stew
veal
type thing. Yeah.
stew in the middle of when it's like 100 degrees outside. And it was just like, this is why I don't prepare it, because it's just not, that's not relevant now. Like that isn't
It's not
relevant.
seasonal. It doesn't make sense. Like I want something light, maybe
Right.
chilled borscht, but not like a heavy stew.
Right. So it was just it was I think a great way to present the conundrum that has has plagued me on and off throughout my career.
So I guess one of the big things is you have a cookbook out, and I'd love to talk to you about your cookbook since that's going to be rolling up on us soon. So tell me about the cookbook, which you said you started like 7, 8 years ago, and here we are in about a month.
Yeah, I was actually looking through some older emails the other day from like 2016, where it was like, "Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm writing a cookbook, and I was wondering if you could help me figure out how to do this." And yeah, to be here now is bizarre, but in a really great way. And yeah, the name of the cookbook is Second Generation, and which applies to me. I'm a second generation American Hungarian, so um, it's not the follow up to a cookbook called First Generation, which is a beautiful cookbook, but and that was debated with the publisher if people would think it's a follow up, and I said I don't, it's not possible. So, but yeah, it was photographed by Ed Anderson, who was really like my dream photographer, and he's done some really beautiful books. And I co-wrote it with Casey Elsass, who's a terrific cookbook writer. And I wanted it to be a book that felt like it had been sitting on your shelf for years. Like I wanted it to be a book that was natural to look at and to reach for and could be a part of your library. And I think the biggest takeaway that I want people to have from the book is to make these recipes and then spin their own second, third, fourth generation version of it and incorporate it into their traditions and their family meals. Um, and I talk about that in the book. It's like there's no one way to do this. It can go as far as you want to take it. And I think that's just kind of the beauty of the book.
So do you have like classics from your restaurant on there? Like if people are regulars to your restaurant, are they going to be able to open up the book and find things that they've had at the restaurant?
Yes. So quite a few things: the deviled eggs, the chicken liver mousse, the stuffed fried squash blossoms with the Hungarian pimento cheese. There is the cheesecake recipe is in there. We're kind of known for our cheesecake, so I did supply that. However, the tuna melt recipe, which if there are people who are listening to this and they've been to Aggie's Counter, they might be excited by that the tuna melt recipe is in there. But I can publicly say that I've taken out a couple of ingredients. But it's the only recipe I've done that for, and I because it's different. It's different to replicate it at home. So I wanted to make sure that it was distinctly different.
You're going to have people at home upset.
Yeah, I mean, like I get it, but yeah, I feel like for the tuna melt, it was. I mean, also you have to like confit the tuna, and you have to have like a lot of oil to do that, and I think so. It's there was a rightful way to present it to home cooks. And
Well, you do have to streamline it for home cooks because there's the flip side of I have all these cookbooks that I've never like. Why do I have the Mugaritz cookbook? I don't know. Like I'm not making anything out of it, right?
Right.
Like you, as a chef, you have all these books quite often, and they're actually not the books I'm cooking. I'm not making anything out of the Noma cookbook. Like it just doesn't make sense. I want a book that I'm going to cook from, and if I pick up your book and it has too many steps, like I work a couple jobs. I have my own businesses. I have kids. Like I want something I can get on the table tonight when I get off this call with you. So,
And I think also for chefs, we have all these cookbooks that we don't necessarily really cook from. But at least for me, I use cookbooks, and maybe it's true for you, but just to kind of like, you look at the photos. Like the photos are incredibly important, and like kind of just even the names of the dishes, and you kind of pull inspiration as you kind of browse, and you leave like 5 of them open on your kitchen counter or your office, and you're just kind of browsing through it, collecting data. And that was really important to me when I made the book, because I wanted it not just to resonate with home cooks and these second generation, grandkids or, people that were families, but I also wanted chefs to be able to like open it and be like, okay, I see what he's doing. Like there's like, I can look at this too and pull some inspiration from it, not necessarily have to cook from it. So I did a point, like I approached it from that chef perspective as well.
What is Hungarian pimento cheese?
So in Hungary, it's called kurzet, and it's got a lot of dots in it over the O's and the T's. And it's a fresh cheese that gets caraway seed whipped into it with raw onion, paprika, sometimes tomato paste, and it can be a dip. You can spread it on crackers. So I grew up spending my summers in the South, and I ate a lot of pimento cheese. So I thought this would be a really cool mashup, and so I made my version of kurzet, and you can eat it with a bag of Ruffles, or you can pipe it into some squash blossoms and fry them, and they're so good.
I love that. I'm a big pimento cheese fan. I'm in Maryland now, which is kind of the South-ish. So it's like I feel like every place or many of the places I like have a version of pimento cheese. So I always have a version on my menus, and sometimes it has kimchi in it. Sometimes it has like giardiniera in it. Sometimes
Yeah.
I smoke the cheese myself. So I'm always looking for a new pimento cheese to eat.
Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna have to check that out because I've never heard of that or had it before.
Yeah, you'll have to give it a try.
Do you have recipes that you're really drawn to in this book? Like if you were to say these are my favorites, and I know it's probably hard, but like, do you have really favorite recipes in this book?
Yes, I do. As I'm flipping through it in my mind, I would say I really do love. There's a recipe for something called lorscht. I love calling things really dumb names. Which is a lamb borscht known as lorscht, that doesn't exist other than in this book. And it's this lamb shoulder that gets like braised down in this kind of really herbaceous, garlicky borscht with golden beets. And it's so comforting, and it's like this one pot wonder that you can serve with incredible bread and pickles, and that'll satisfy an entire family. There's also the semolina dumpling recipe that I talked about is in there as well, but I do it with radishes that are in season, and I use the stems, and you can either do it with like a chicken broth that I have a specific recipe for, or a Parmesan rind broth that works really well with it. And the pastrami tongue. I'm sure
Ooh, that sounds
not a
great.
lot of people are going to want to cook tongue.
See, that would be my first thing that I would go for.
Yeah, I had to include tongue. I grew up with it. And I've made various, versions of it throughout my career. So I was pretty stubborn about putting it in there, and the publisher was like, I don't know, and I was like, unfortunately, it's a package deal. You get this book, you get the tongue recipe.
So I'm totally down with that. So you've got at least one person who's going to try and make that. And
Thank you. Yes.
I'm sure with so many chefs who listen to this show, we'll have a couple people who, so maybe we'll like have to send a note, like say nice things. We'll put it on Instagram, right?
Yeah.
Tag you, and say,
Yes.
We made it, made the pastrami tongue.
Get the algorithm to pick up on tongue, which
Yes.
would be a good thing or a bad thing. So.
Yeah, it's but I think it's so much a Jewish thing too, right? I mean, like I have cooked it in places I've worked. I have friends who that was their jam. I mean, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily as common on all American tables, but I think if you're going to do Jewish type cooking, to have that there totally makes sense.
Yeah, it's and in ways it kind of tastes like brisket. That's how like people that haven't had it before, that's how I describe it. When it's cooked just right, it kind of has this like, that flavor profile, or even the texture of it can be kind of briskety, which I don't know, to me, I really love. So
once you braise anything for enough hours, it all is pretty much the same.
It's all brisket. So
yeah. From the technical standpoint, how hard was it for you to write a cookbook? Because a lot of chefs, we wing things, or you even have like a basic recipe that your cooks can follow, but to have a cookbook that is, you've got to test the recipes. And I know you've worked with people. How did you find that process to be?
Yeah, it was kind of a shit show. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it and be like, yeah, I'm great at math and converting, and it was so natural for me to always write down recipes. No, it was god awful. And in ways it made me much better at writing recipes now and keeping track of them, and I learned a lot of lessons from it. But it was definitely a curveball learning wise on how to, especially to write it for a home cook. Uh, but I had my grandmothers read it. I had my mom read it. I had their friends read it. I bought like ingredients for different people, like friends of friends of friends, and they made it with their families. And they would report back to me on how it came out. And so definitely a lot of labor went into making sure it was accessible for the home cook.
Are there any ingredients in either your recipes or Hungarian cooking that are harder to find? Maybe like if you're not in a place like New York City where we can get everything. I mean, obviously you can get stuff on Amazon, but are there traditional Hungarian ingredients that are a little more challenging?
Yeah, well, I mean, it paprika, which is so readily available in any grocery store,
And
it
probably
actually,
mediocre in many grocery stores.
yeah, it's not really paprika. I mean, it is and it isn't. The stuff from a grocery store, I think what people don't really know is that paprika has a very distinct flavor. It's this really robust, beautiful flavor and color. That's just like unlike any other spice. And um, when you get high quality paprika, it really does make all the difference. And you're supposed to toast it for like 10 seconds, even in its ground form. Um, and a lot of people don't know that, and they use it as, so it kind of falls to the wayside as this garnish on your mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving.
Deviled eggs, just a little shake, right? That's what
Exactly.
makes them deviled. You just put a little paprika on there, and it comes out of this. If it's still in a metal can, it's too old. That
Yeah.
McCormick metal tin,
Yeah.
your grandmother's had that for 20 years.
Throw
It's
that
no
out.
good anymore. Yeah.
Don't risk it. Yeah. So finding really good paprika is hard. But Burlap and Barrel, which is a really great spice company, I think they've done a really terrific job at sourcing a sweet paprika that they call their noble paprika, and then a hot paprika. Um, and also, yeah, if you can also buy it online, like Kalustians, which is a big spice store in Manhattan. They have a website where that you can ship it. Um, yeah, but I would say most Hungarian-esque ingredients are pretty readily available, uh, mostly anywhere in America, other than like Hungarian salami, which is you need to go to Hungary to go get that.
Oh, what's in Hungarian salami? Or
Yeah,
what's
so
the
there's
what's the flavor profile like?
yeah, it's a hard it's an aged salami that tastes it's really fatty. It's like kind of greasy. Like it kind of when you cut into it, there's actually like it looks like it's sweating, which I know is really gross, but it's so good. And um the fat, like the fat cubes can be like really chunky, and it's just I don't know, there's something really special about it. It's so delicious. And there's one brand that's called Pick, which was my grandmother's favorite, and they've been around for like 100 years. And they do have a version of it here in America. Again, not the real version. But if you go to Hungary, try and smuggle it back into the country. But don't tell people that I told you to do that.
Yeah, how I landed in a Hungarian prison. That'll be
Yes.
one of my podcast episodes one
Not
day.
something you want to experience, I'm sure.
Do you recommend, do you think that would be a fun place to go for people who are interested in traveling? Because I don't think that that's one of those places that kind of pops up when you're thinking about traveling. As someone who's been, like, would you recommend that, say, I go there if I like fun places and good food?
Absolutely. Yeah. Hungary is is beautiful. It's also got yeah, there's so much to eat, so many markets to explore. There's bathhouses like that are gorgeous, they're ornate, and there's so much like life and culture to just kind of like browse and see while you're at these bathhouses, which is really interesting. And the coffee houses are grand, and you can go have a beautiful pastry like in the middle of the day with a cappuccino and read a book. But maybe what's even more exciting about Hungary right now is its wine scene, and there's so many young producers doing really cool things, all on the borders of Hungary, especially around like Lake Balaton, which is Hungary's largest lake. There's just a lot of cool, like you can take day trips out to the vineyards, and I think it's a part of Hungary that tourists don't really even think to explore. So I would highly recommend that.
Okay, I'm looking for an international trip in a year or so, and I'm not wanting to go to like one of those big major Rome, Paris,
Yeah.
kind of the touristy places. I'm looking for something that's a little off the beaten path and also very fun though.
Yeah, and from Hungary, you could take like a day trip into Vienna,
Yeah.
Austria. You could also take a day trip into northern Italy. So Hungary is like a great jumping point for other great countries.
Oh, great. I'll have to start getting my wife thinking about that. It'll take a little priming,
Yeah.
maybe. Do you ever get bored of cooking the same type of food? Because you're in a place that has a very specific cuisine. I talk to a lot of chefs, and a lot of them kind of, jump around and do different types of things. But I think when you're locked into one style, does that get old? And do you have days where you're like, man, I just want to cook some Italian food, Mexican food, whatever?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I'm actually where I'm currently recording this podcast with you. I'm sitting in my new restaurant, which is uh, definitely leaning away from the Eastern European narrative because I needed an outlet to explore my other passions, in cuisine. So that's kind of fueling that at the moment and feeding that. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's Eastern European food is and Jewish food is definitely it's a part of my blood and always will be. But I don't I don't like putting myself in a box forever. So, and I feel like a lot of chefs probably have the same thought.
Yeah, I mean, I love what I do, especially being a personal chef, because it's different cuisines like almost every night.
Yeah.
And some days I kind of do need like that box. Like when I ask people what they like, when they say everything, then my mind is like, oh my God, like I don't even know where to start. So it is nice when people will say, I like these cuisines or something. But I've always said, I don't know how, like people, I've been 10 years at this Italian place. I'm like, oh, I can't imagine cooking Italian food for 50, 60 hours a week for 10 years. Like I don't think I could do it.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, especially when you feel like you've exhausted kind of like every avenue. But the truth is that there's so much to explore with. I think with Eastern European cuisine and so much that has been untouched. And I'm not the only chef that's doing something new with this. And I think there's just so many. Yeah, there's so many new and inspiring things happening with it, which is pretty cool.
Well, and being located where you are, in my opinion, probably weighs into it. Like, how universally accepted do you think your restaurant would be? Like, I'm sure Brooklyn and New York has helped. Do you see this as a restaurant that you could easily have be successful in other places?
It's a great question. I've been told that Augie's Counter would do well in London.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we
Sister
did a
restaurant.
yeah. So we did a pop up there back in February with our friends at Cafe Deco, and I had a lot of emails coming afterwards, being like, yeah, we're missing kind of like this Eastern European restaurant here, and it would be really great to have like because I also think that Augie's is in ways approachable. Like it takes things that you're kind of familiar with or things that are identifiable, but also is new and different. So it's this mashup of things that make it, I think, accessible even for the picky eaters or the more hesitant to dine out and try things. So yeah, it depends. I mean, would an Augie's Counter do really well in Boca Raton, Florida, where I grew up? Probably not. Even though it's like, you'd think all the old people would come and eat it, but um, but things have changed so drastically over there. It's so much more. It's younger now, but it's a different kind of young than like a New York City young. So I don't know if that makes any sense to listeners, but I think it would really depend.
What have we not talked about that you want to share with our listeners today?
I mean, the cookbook comes out on September 17th, and you should get a copy.
I love it. Well, I will link everything in the show notes, as I always do. People will be able to easily find the book. If they're not following you online, I'll direct them to all of your social medias, and they can check out said delicious looking food.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time and for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for coming on the show. And to all of our listeners, this is Chris with Chefs Without Restaurants. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.